Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bergen. I'm an Irishman, an Irish ecologist who lives in the northwest of Scotland. My paid work is to do surveys of vegetation and habitats, and my background is of somebody who, from quite an early age, was fascinated by politics and by maps, and also by languages and names, particularly place names. And today I just want to maybe, through taking you through some of my own experiences as a crisis mapper, perhaps give you some insight into what some of our activities actually amount to. Just give you a little bit of an idea of what's been involved in several different places where we have been involved, or I've been involved online. I'm not saying I'm particularly typical necessarily, but anyway, to move from the general to the specific perhaps. And the way that I got involved in crisis mapping, first of all, was that I have friends and also a long-standing interest in North Africa and the Middle East. And in 2011, after returning from a trip to Algeria, and of course, when I came back in January of 2011, things were starting to happen in Tunisia, and then quickly, well, not sure exactly domino-wise, but it was quickly followed by events starting in Egypt, in Bahrain, briefly in Algeria. In fact, nothing really developed in Algeria, but that's another very, very long story. And then, of course, Libya and Syria later on. And I became aware of the fact that there was a group which was trying to monitor the situation online in Libya. And so this was the Libya Crisis Map project, which was originally started, I wasn't involved at that stage, by the Standby Task Force, and then became a project which was run by UN OCHA. OCHA means the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So we had quite a large team. I'm not sure exactly how many, but could easily have been a couple of hundred volunteers who were involved in various stages. It ran for 2, possibly 3 months. I was only there probably for the last month and a half. And as I said, my background is in maps, and I use GIS in my work quite a lot to produce maps showing habitats, geographical information systems. And also my fascination with names and place names on maps meant that I quickly, in a rather nerd-like way, wanted to make sure that when we had a report about a particular incident or an event, that it was located to the correct place. And of course, as I'm sure some of you are aware, you can see there on that particular map, you've got the Arabic names and you've got the English names. And transliteration from Arabic into English can be a little bit of a minefield, and you get lots of different versions and you can easily be led astray. So I was one of the sort of nerdy people who was trying to ensure that we tried to avoid mistakes like that. We developed sort of lists of place names, their synonyms, and a sort of central database of latitudes and longitudes, so that when we got a report, the red dots, these measly maps that we produced, and they're characteristic, if you like, of Ushahidi, because this is a map based on the Ushahidi platform. Ushahidi meaning, I believe, witness. Yeah, in Swahili. And this was, from one part of Africa providing the technology, if you like, to enable another part of Africa to be reported so the world would see what was going on. At least that was certainly the idea that motivated many of us who got engaged in this particular project. And the idea was partly just to monitor events, all events really, that related to the political and indeed the violent crisis, the war that was going on in Libya at the time, but also try and ensure that particularly from the UN point of view, that we got good information on the needs of the people who were suffering in many cases. They didn't have adequate food or water or other sanitary, etc. Resources weren't available to them, and when it became possible to get these resources into Libya from Misrata and through the Nafusa Mountains, south of Tripoli, etc., that we were well organised and the information was good to get it in there. So, but that's the good. I think the title of my, yes, the good, the bad, and the ugly of crisis mapping. I don't want you to go away, however, thinking that you see a map like this. These maps are very powerful. They look wonderful, and you have colours, you have nice keys and things like that. They look really quite impressive. But I know to my cost, as an ecologist, a professional who works with maps all the time, that it's very easy to produce a very good map. But just because it's got nice colours on it and it's got jazzy icons and symbols on it doesn't mean that it's always good. And problems did emerge with Libya, with the Libya crisis map. Part of the problem was that we weren't entirely sure, just referred earlier to the issue of verification. And this was a big, big issue with Libya. A lot of the reports were coming through various media sources, and it became apparent that some of them were perhaps being gamed by some of the one of the two sides involved, the Gaddafi and the anti-Gaddafi sides. And generally, I think a lot of people took the lesson from the Libya crisis map deployment that political engagements for crisis mapping can be, to say the least of it, problematic. And although there have been subsequent deployments which have had some political aspects, and for example in Syria there have been projects where they've sought to use satellite tagging to look at damage or concentrations of military hardware, etc. Nonetheless, relying on sources, media sources or even sources on the ground to try and give you a picture of what's happening in a war, it can be difficult, particularly if it's plugged into a crowdsourcing system where many of the volunteers may lack sophisticated understanding of what actually is happening on the ground. So, after Libya, I still very much interested, as I am today, in political events in the Middle East. Got particularly engaged in looking at some of the early stages of what was happening in Syria. And this is a map that a colleague of mine, a Korean American who I've never met, called Esther Kim, we produced after a couple of months of pretty detailed research, trying to get some understanding, a little bit of a deeper understanding than was available in the mainstream media of, people knew that Homs in Syria was one of the, particularly in the early couple of months, the battlegrounds of the revolution there. But people they heard these place names and they didn't understand, what's happening here, what's happening there, etc. And I don't have a pointer, I'm afraid, but simplifying things dramatically, on the whole you have this sort of diagonal zone, the slightly darker sort of pink, which was the area which was Sunni dominated, often relatively poorer areas or relatively newer parts of the city, and it was there that the strongholds of the rebels were based, the strongholds of the opposition. Whereas some of these paler areas, such as Zahra there, these were occupied mainly by Alawi people from the Alawi minority who had come into Homs, mainly from the coastal provinces often further north, and they were very strongly still for the regime. So once we started to understand that, and again some of the other aspects in terms of the different kind of building patterns and the density of the buildings and so on within the city, I think it offered a little bit more of an insight into exactly what was happening in these areas. And this map was done using various old maps that people sent us. It was compiled after talking to many different contacts, either from the city, even in some cases in the city. And none of the boundaries were put on without comprehensive checking with several different sources before they were sort of finally put together. And it was used subsequently, and by the BBC, by the New York Times, by the Guardian, and a lot of maps that you see of the city nowadays are actually basically based on our original map. So that's a very specialised application, if you like, of crisis mapping. That's where Esther and I felt that the broader kind of crowdsourced approach probably wasn't going to be particularly suitable for this. This was something where we needed to develop good relationships, close relationships with contacts, with specialists, and then finally be ready to produce something that we felt was sufficiently solid to go out into the public domain. I've still been involved in various other projects relating to Syria since then. Purely just Esther and myself and a couple of other collaborators. We've looked at the ethnic and confessional boundaries in Idlib and Aleppo, for example. But since then, I've become much more involved with the Standby Task Force and moving more into the more purely non-conflict but rather humanitarian side of crisis mapping. And again, this is a tale really of crisis mapping which didn't work out as well as it maybe could have done. You maybe remember back in June of this year there were these devastating floods that came down from the Himalaya, particularly in the headwaters of the Ganges. Bridges were swept away, roads were swept away. There were tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of pilgrims who were up in these valleys, many of whom were stranded, in some cases for days. Now, it was an event which in many ways seemed to be tailor-made for crisis mapping. We had great interest. We had quite a lot of photographs. We had social media which was producing information about what was happening. The Indian diaspora in North America and in Europe, and of course lots of people in Delhi and bigger cities, they think, we must do something here. What can we do? And there was a perception, which I find a little bit difficult to judge because I'm not terribly conversant with the situation in India, that the response of the Indian government was somewhat inadequate, particularly in the first couple of days, that people wanted information, they couldn't find information. So, a man called Hemant Purohit, who works in the university in Ohio, with a project called Crises, looking at monitoring of social media and trying to extract useful information for crisis mapping. He started an effort online where he started to reach out to people and see if we could together do something to help here. And to be honest, in the end, I'm not sure that we really succeeded in helping greatly. And I think it's been one of the lessons that we have is to look back and see, a lot of people, probably, 30, 40, 50 people at various times got involved in this. We did try and achieve something over the course of about a fortnight, and the problems did continue for actually much longer than that. But I think the lessons that we have learned, perhaps, were that one of the key fundamental tenets of being able to do crisis mapping that actually delivers good to the people who need good is that you plug your efforts into what's happening on the ground. And in this case, the government said, look, we don't need your help. However, there were NGOs, Indian and international NGOs, who were active in this area. And they have an umbrella body, I'm not sure if they all belong to it, but many of them do, called Sphere India. And we tried to liaise with them and to develop a relationship and see if we could help. But somehow or other that didn't quite work, probably for reasons on both sides. Partly that they weren't used to working with an online community, and they didn't quite know how the mechanics of it would work, and they didn't know how to ask the right questions, and maybe we didn't know exactly how they worked either. Also, there was rather too much of a focus on Twitter, because Hemant mainly works with Twitter. He felt that this was where he automatically, instinctively sought the information. But actually, the amount of information coming directly from the affected areas on Twitter was really very small. There were lots of people in Delhi and other parts of urban India who were talking about this, and sometimes they were talking about their relations who possibly were in these areas, but relatively speaking, the amount of useful information was really pretty small. So that was definitely another problem. And the third problem, I think, was that we never quite managed to organize ourselves into sufficiently streamlined structure, which was able to both internally communicate well about the different tasks that might be required, but also then to talk in a focused way and an efficient way with the kind of partners such as this Sphere India or the UN or the Indian government. So it unfortunately didn't quite work out, despite the great goodwill and genuine desire to help that was present in many people. Okay, we move now to another example from this year, the floods in Khartoum in Sudan, which didn't receive an awful lot of coverage in the world media, partly because, although it was quite a respectable disaster in some ways, in that at least 200 people were killed, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands were made homeless, but the Sudanese government didn't want to let the world know that it was struggling to cope with the situation. So therefore, they never said, we have a disaster, they never said this is an emergency, and coverage of Sudan by the international press is generally very poor. It doesn't encourage journalists to come in, and the focus of the world's press was mainly on Egypt at the time, and so on the whole it didn't make huge ripples. Now, in Khartoum, once the floods happened and once it was apparent that the government was struggling to cope with the situation on the ground, a very impressive group of grassroots activists, social activists, organised themselves into a group. And literally this happened almost in 24 hours. I could see it happening because I was already talking to quite a lot of these activists, because I was involved with advising them a little bit on setting up another kind of mapping project, not so much a crisis mapping project, a social mapping project to look at gathering information on the resources available to schools in Sudan, a project called Madrasatna, means our school. So I was already talking to them, and I can see this suddenly getting together. It's amazing sometimes, how you can see this kind of just dynamic in front of your eyes. And they formed a group called Nafir, which means clarion call. It's a kind of a word with great meaning and resonance in Sudan. Most of the people were in Khartoum, some in other parts of Sudan, and others were in the Sudanese diaspora, particularly in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. And they set up a kind of a call center, and they started to get information from people in the affected areas. And just to try and explain a little bit without getting too lost in the details, the pale brown is on the whole the initial area that was affected by the floods. And then the sort of yellowy green is a situation about 3 or 4 days later. I think this is probably the 11th of August. The green is about the 13th of August. And although the Sudanese government wasn't terribly keen on letting international bodies get involved, they did grudgingly let the small number of UN people on the ground, particularly with the UN Development Project, UNDP, to try and get some help in terms of satellite imagery. And this is the next one. Yeah, this is one of the most impressive things I've seen in crisis mapping. And in some ways it's not quite the kind of crowdsourced crisis mapping that we're mainly talking about, but basically once UNDP people and UN OCHA in Sudan said, look, we have a problem here. There are a lot of people that are being seriously affected. We need to get a handle on where the worst affected areas are as soon as possible. They activated this thing called the Disaster Charter, or I think it's technically called the International Charter of Space and Major Disasters. And again, in front of my eyes, I saw that, with a couple of emails which reached both the satellite imagery providers and the State Department in the US, really with the minimum of formality, they basically said, yeah, this looks good, you've got a real problem here, we're going to pay for it. The satellite provider said, okay, yeah, and here's the imagery. And this is expensive stuff, it's really good quality imagery. They agreed, to do special runs dedicated to the areas that were being affected. And a combination of the Nafir people on the ground who were getting these calls, and I and a couple of others were helping them to map these calls within different parts of Khartoum. Very roughly, where you see the blue dots, there was usually some impact from the floods. And initially, we were trying to see which areas required the satellite imagery, and also at this stage I should say that the very impressive Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. OpenStreetMap is an open source map which is trying to sort of map the world in an open source way. Very, very impressive in a lot of the world, particularly in Germany, in Francophone Africa, in Haiti, etc., where they've done amazing work. And Severan Menard and myself and a couple of others, we started looking to see where the evidence was. Initially we thought these orange areas were the priority areas, and then we got more information, widened it out, and these blue polygons here were the areas that we passed on to the UN and said, look, this is where we need the imagery, this is where it's most urgent. And we sent the email and the map, and bang, we got the imagery a day or sometimes 2 days later. It was really quite quick. I mean, this was quite a small piece of activity though in many ways. We had this, a lot of hundreds of NAFIA volunteers on the ground in Khartoum, but actually online there was only probably 4 or 5. Stan Jonas came in and helped for a while, 1 or 2 others at other times, and Settleman, a couple of other people from HOT. There was also, we didn't have the OpenStreetMap of Khartoum didn't have sufficient detail for some of these areas that were affected, because they're mainly the new areas of Khartoum. And this is one of the interesting cases for me as a kind of joker, if you like, in that if you look at Khartoum, you see this is old Khartoum, and also then Bahri here, and then Omdurman across the way. Now, in fact, these old Omdurman wasn't really affected, so that probably went away this evening, but this area here wasn't affected at all, because of course they settled principally where they knew they were safe from the floods. But as the city expanded, it expanded into areas. So particularly, there's this old, long-established and rather large Wadi Soda, and of course the floods came whacking through here. There's a kind of a big road here which acted as a dam, hit the dam and spread left and right, and affected tens of thousands of people. And I think I won't get too bogged down in that. How am I doing for time?
It's 1 o'clock.
Right, okay, I'll try and finish pretty quickly then. This is, again, really just showing you how the GIS side worked. This is really another map of Khartoum. I don't think it's really, I think just, we got information on the needs of the people who were calling into the NAFIA call centre. So different colours, for example, green is mosquito nets, and the plastic sheets, everybody wanted plastic sheets for shelter, etc. This is again the kind of nerdy kind of thing that I particularly tend to get involved with, making sure that our place names are accurate, etc. They're located. We have the Arabic, we have the Latin, etc. Another aspect of mapping in or for Khartoum is that you've got the Abena protests, the political protests that arose recently, where again partly coming on foot of the inadequacy of the government response to the floods, then the government put up the fuel prices, and there were these protests, 100, maybe 200 people killed in Khartoum. And here, the geography of the protest was very much around the university areas, of the university here, the university of those pink dots, and the university over in Omdurman as well. And finally, returning to India, just recently, over the last week and a half or so, maybe not even that, we've had Cyclone Phylin, which came in and hit Odisha and Andhra Pradesh on the southeast facing coast of India. Now, again, it was an activation, not a formal activation, but an initiative, if you like, which possibly struggled to achieve as much as it set out to do so, but at least we were better organised this time, and we did have a relationship with Sphere. India, they did say, right, we could use this information, that information, and some, I think, useful information was gathered on where there was damage, where there were power cuts, and again, sometimes we were able to collate information from the internet more quickly than the Sphere people on the ground. So it wasn't in any way a perfect initiative, but at least lessons can be learned, were learned, and hopefully next time again it might be better. And I think I'll stop there.